Hey everyone, I am super excited today to have with us our dear friend, an incredible guest, and someone that has an amazing story. Our guest today is the one and only Frida Polli, Dr. Frida Polli, I should say, the CEO of a phenomenal company called Pymetrics. And if you've not heard about it, I highly advise you to go check it out because they are a game-changing company for the past since 2015 when they've been around. But Frida has the most amazing story possible. She is a neuroscientist. She went to Dartmouth, Harvard, MIT, right? So if that's not enough for you, I don't know what is. She also is a mother of, if I'm not mistaken, three beautiful children, and she is just a phenomenal person. So I am super excited to have her with us today to share her story, the lessons she learned that got her to where she is now, so we can apply that to our own life. So Frida, thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely. So excited to be here.
You're welcome. So Frida, let me get this straight. Harvard, MIT, Dartmouth, neuroscientist, degree after degree after degree. We really
I'm overeducated. Yes,
over.
absolutely.
Me too.
Your audience should definitely know that. It's not a requirement for having a job. I just happen to be overeducated. Yes.
Well, I hope your children are going to be able to satisfy that
No, maybe my kids won't even graduate high school. What can I say? Just to be different from their parents.
And would you be okay with that?
I mean, yeah, I think everyone has their own path in life. So I mean, I guess I'd say a couple things. I think everyone has their own path in life. And so I think, I think I would definitely not expect, any or all of my kids to necessarily follow my path. I do actually think there's value to education. I mean, I think that I have mixed feelings about education. I think education is such a wonderful, mind expanding tool, right? I mean, I watched this documentary recently on inmates, some of whom were basically incarcerated for life, getting a bachelor's degree, and how it totally made them think differently about the world, right? So I think education is such a gift. And I also think that unfortunately it's very expensive, time consuming, and it's not accessible. It's not, bachelor's degree is not accessible. I mean, in the US, it's only a third of people have it. So while I think education is fantastic, I don't think it should be a barrier to entry for a job. And I think that's where I feel strongly that, you should not, force someone to have a bachelor's degree in order to earn access to all these different jobs. Unfortunately, that is what we do right now. And so that's what I'm sort of less excited about when it comes to college degrees.
So then let's play this scenario through our head over here.
Sure.
Your kid comes home, says, Mom, I just graduated high school. I'm not interested in going to college. I want to take, let's say, a gap year, 3-year gap, or whatever it is. I want to explore my own passion, whatever
Yeah.
that passion is. Would you allow to do that?
Yeah, I think I would, and I think like, I mean, I had a mentor of mine whose child wanted to be a dancer, and this was also another overeducated, Ivy League trained person. And this child had, thought very carefully through this life choice, had really found, like, sort of figured out all the sorts of ways she needed to prepare herself for that. And so I think that, and again, I mean, I think I would definitely want to sit down with, because again, we are lucky that we can afford, for our kids to go to college. So I think then it's less about like, well, you don't have access to it. So then you'd have to think like, okay, well, what is the reason behind this and everything? And so, I think I would probably still encourage it because I do think education is so critical. And I've learned, just I love learning. But I also think there's so many ways of learning in life, and I think a college degree is just one way of learning. And I think if you had a totally different pathway and you wanted to move to Africa and I don't know, do something crazy and, experiential and, learn that way, I think, there are many different pathways to learning. So
Right, for sure. And part of some of the best learning is obviously just self-learning, like being an entrepreneur
absolutely.
yourself and
Yeah.
experiencing. You can only we only get to learn, first I've got the quotes missing me, but like, real hands-on experience is something that cannot be compensated for anything. You can learn from the books and the books, and you can read another book, and always feel like you're never gonna know enough, and therefore, because you feel like you never know enough, you'll never start, right?
Totally.
So you have
Yeah.
to go out there. So
Yep.
like,
And now my teenager is going to find this podcast when she is debating whether she should go to college. Be like, Mom, you said.
and then I have to ask
We'll have
you.
to keep this podcast hidden.
We'll make sure she doesn't find it.
Exactly.
But I have to ask you, most times when someone is, you obviously have people that love learning, and
Mhm.
therefore they can
Yep.
stay in school for multiple
Yep.
years.
Yep.
But you also have the aspect when people are trying to always overcompensate, it's always
Hmm.
because they're running away from something, they're running away from
Sure.
themselves, or they feel like they need to prove,
Yep.
whoever it was, their dad, their mom, or something like that. Where were you running to?
Well, so so I've always been a nerd. I think nerds like school, so let's just start with that, right? I just love learning. I love school. I was like the kid that always did their homework. Like I was a nerd. Um, so I wasn't. I don't think I was running from. I think I was running to, and I think what ended up leading to my becoming a neuroscientist was I had a family member of mine who had a very severe mental illness that I watched, for my entire growing up period. And this person was so impaired and had such difficulty navigating the world. And, it was just a real struggle. And so as a result, it really made me fascinated with the brain because, this person had actually, interestingly enough, had had a career as a musician, had been a, sort of concert trained violinist, and then, essentially had a, very severe mental illness sort of take over their life in a way that I would has taken over their life for the rest of this person's life, right? And really never recovered. And so I think that seeing that, I sort of was very, and seeing it at a very young age, like I was very, I was very impressionable, and really it made me want to learn more about the human brain and why certain things happen to the human brain, what can we do about them. I mean, it just sort of triggered my sense of empathy as well. Just watching this person struggle for so long was just so hard. um and and that's what led me to neuroscience, and it was a very fortunate time because for me to become interested in it, because brain image, so prior to brain imaging, which was essentially sort of discovered or basically created, I guess, in 1988. Basically the functional magnetic resonance imaging was first done in 1988. So until then, to study the brain, you had to like either torture poor monkeys or cut off heads of rats or whatever. And I was just like, wow, I would never be able to do that. And so because fMRI and brain imaging came into existence essentially, shortly before I graduated college and started entering grad school. It was just a very fortunate time that I was like, wow, this is, and I remember distinctly taking a class in brain imaging my last year in college and was like, wow, this is what I want to do. And so for me, it was more like a passion to learn more about, the human brain and sort of all of the ways in which it's beautiful. And then all of the ways in which it can somehow, things can go awry and someone can really struggle and suffer. So, and I think those two things are tied. I read this book and I forget what the title of the book is, but if you look at sort of mental illness or other types of disorders, whether it's schizophrenia or autism or dyslexia or whatever, like if they had no value, right, they would have actually been sort of genetically extinguished from the gene pool, right? And the whole book was basically saying like people, you know, schizophrenia is on a spectrum of things that often also leads to family members of these relatives being very creative, being very artistic, blah, blah, blah. So yes, occasionally you get someone with schizophrenia, but in that sort of family pool, you get artists and musicians and like all the rest of it, right? And so the learning for me was that the brain is so different, and there are so many like amazing things that the brain can do. And then sometimes something will go too wrong on one end of the spectrum, and then it becomes something that's very impairing to someone. But that diversity in the brain, neurodiversity as we call it, is something to be embraced. And I really believe that. And then I mean, again, like my family also has strong history of dyslexia, ADHD, mood disorders. I mean, a whole host of, what some people call disabilities, and certainly are disabilities. But the other way to think about it is, through the lens of neurodiversity. And I think when you have a family history of that, it really makes you just think about all of the ways in which the brain is different, and the amazing things that can come out of that, rather than only seeing, sort of the negatives. So
Well, you can also look at it. I mean, that's amazing, and thank you for that whole history.
sure.
Incredible to see, all the incredible books and people writing about it, especially in the early days of fMRI. Especially now you have so many books talking about it. I'm learning about, I guess, mental illness. I'm
Mhm.
learning about how our mind works.
Mhm.
Gives us the ability, obviously, to deal with these things. But instead of looking at it as like, this is someone that has a disability, this is someone that obviously, is, um, I wouldn't call it a disability, something that is more of like a special need. Like you never call someone
Mhm.
retarded, I call it special needs because they have certain things, capabilities that are much higher than us, than other types of people. All
Yep,
right. Obviously, every single person has their purpose, but
for
going
sure.
back to growing up like that, I mean, you obviously have to grow up much quicker.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, when you have any kind of, family history of, somebody who has any kind of special need, right? It definitely impacts the whole family, and I think it just makes it just changes the family dynamic in a way, and it definitely makes, children in that family definitely more, need to sort of develop additional skills. I mean, I see this actually in, we have another relative that has a child with very, a significant genetic disorder that has led to all sorts of developmental delays. And, in that family, like it really does, like the family centers around this child. And, obviously the two other children, have to adapt in a way that, my three kids, for better or worse, have not had to. So I think whenever you're dealing with a special situation like that, it really it does impact the entire family unit, hopefully in a way that's positive, but sometimes not always. I think in our family, I think what ended up happening was that, or at least for me, I just developed a strong empathy for people, it just made me much more empathic towards folks that, um, just had that, needed more, resources and all of that. And I think, sort of like, I think it can sort of take you out of a bubble. And not that we lived in a bubble, but I'm just saying, I didn't grow up in poverty. Didn't grow up in a war zone. I didn't, so I could have grown up in a bubble. But I think that because whenever you see people that are struggling for whatever reason, it really kind of takes you out of that bubble, and you just realize kind of like, that suffering is kind of like a part of humanity that, is very common actually. And it can come in many different forms. And, in our case, it was watching someone suffer, and it was hard, so.
It's totally true. It's like this is, and
Not
but
a it's not a happy topic, but it is, it's a real topic, right? Because I think a lot of times when you have any kind of, history of that, whether it's mental illness or alcoholism or whatever the thing is, right? I think a lot of people are very, you might feel ashamed, you might feel, oh, I don't want to talk about it. It's embarrassing. Nobody else is suffering with this. And, I think more and more, I think hopefully we can live in a society where people are more open about the fact that these things happen,
right.
in large proportion, that everybody has some family member that has, or not just one, but multiple, or whatever, that families just are full of, you know, like, I don't want to say, they're full of things that we as children think are embarrassing or shameful or whatever. And the more we can try to break out of that, I think the better. And it just sort of, again, goes back to this idea that, fundamentally we're all human, and, humanity is, has, millennia's worth of history of suffering, and that can come in many different formats, so.
And 100%, and I always like this. One of my theories is that let's say for hypothetically, let's say only 200 problems in the world, that a person could go through. Every single person is going to go through those 200 problems,
Yep.
but in their own narrative.
Right. Yep.
What as humanity, what we could do is we can't necessarily compare, but we could identify with each other on those
Yep.
issues and share our shared experiences in order to connect and help each other go through those together.
For sure.
Um,
Yep.
But
Yep.
one of the things you
And
see, go ahead.
no, nothing. And, at the same time, I think that, like, I think it's just like any other thing. Like, I think everybody's experience is unique, right? And so, you never want to try to put yourself in someone's shoes and say, oh gosh, because I had this experience, I now understand everything. Like, that's, I don't think that that's the right approach. I think that, but I think that this experience and associated experiences just made me more aware of all of the different ways in which people, can experience the world. And I think that was, really important sort of, learning for me. So
I know this is an entrepreneurship podcast, so we relate
yes,
to.
I know we're a little off
So,
topic here, but
so
yes.
we relate. I relate that one point to entrepreneurship is that's very funny because I was recently speaking with a founder, and I think multiple people could agree with this. Um, is that you have to allow founders to make every single mistake in the book and go through that
Hmm.
experience.
Hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
You can read the hard things about hard things and 0 to 1
Right.
and founders experience and try to replicate their type
Hmm.
of thing. But you
Yep.
have to understand, for example, you are showing up here today, Frida's showing up today as all the micro decisions and micro and macro decisions she made for the
Hmm.
past however many years, right?
Yep.
And all
Yep.
the experience that she went through, that's how you show up and that's how you're able to lead your company,
Right.
everything like that. So
Yep.
you following someone else's formula won't work. And same thing, entrepreneurship, having that experience and
Yep.
going through that is the only
Yep.
way to become a successful founder. And,
Yep.
obviously don't make the same mistake twice, but go through that.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And
but
also like, and on the topic of entrepreneurship, I do think, it's really interesting because I think Brad Feld has written about this. I think it's Brad Feld. I think he's been fairly open about sort of having, struggles, struggles with a mood disorder. And there's been lots of, I think, research done that, entrepreneurship is very stressful and it's sort of the under discussed sort of underbelly, let's say, of entrepreneurship. And, I myself have also had similar struggles in terms of like, it can be very stressful. And, again, I come from this family history of, certain predispositions and, have certainly struggled with, a mood disorder at times. And I think it is the under discussed, one of the under discussed aspects of being a founder is that like, it's an amazing job. It's incredible. It's just so inspiring. You really feel like, my gosh, I'm bringing something to the world. Hopefully you feel this way, that's really going to help people, change people's lives, whatever. But at the same time, it's very hard. There's moments of time where you're just like, wow, I don't know if I can do this anymore. And it's also fairly lonely because, you're the founder, like, and so therefore, or, even if you have a co-founder, I think, you're a founder. So like other people are along the journey with you, but they're not like, sort of out there leading leading the charge. So like you're the one who's responsible for leading them in a good direction. So anyways, the only reason I say that is because I think that, again, it's back to, I think it's a pretty under discussed like issue where, it's hard to be a founder, it's hard to be in startups. It's also an amazing thing. I would never, be anything else. But I think we just have to realize that it's, there's a sort of under discussed aspect of it. And I think, again, the more we can talk about it, I think the less sort of shame or secrecy there is to it. I think the better, because then we can just sort of be open to the fact that, it's back to everybody has struggles and, it can be hard. So
so then let's start fixing it now. Start talking about it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think like, I mean, I'm fairly open about all this stuff because, again, I think, having spent so much time as a neuroscientist, I really do think that if we are not transparent about all of the things that can go wrong, could go wrong, are wrong, things that we're struggling with, and we just present this sort of, sort of, I don't want to say fake, that's too strong a word, but this sort of like cheery, rosy image, I think that doesn't serve people well, because then when they hit the stumbling block and they start, having a lot of anxiety or depression or whatever, they might be like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? I'm the only one. I'm at, like, there's something wrong with me. And instead of normalizing it and saying, actually, I think it's like some crazy statistics, like where 20% of, founders or something have, fairly significant episodes of, anxiety, depression, and all the rest of it, and again, even the hard things about the hard things, right? Like Ben Horowitz talks about, like, crying, at night. And I've heard that from other, male founders, like curled up in a ball, crying like a baby. Right. And I think the more we talk about that, the better, because then when a younger generation of founders comes along and, they experience all the highs and the euphoria and this, that, and the other, and then they hit a roadblock and, they're crying like a baby, then they, male, female, whatever gender, whatever race, then they won't feel like, my gosh, what's wrong with me? They'll think, oh, okay, this is just part of the journey and I have to expect it. You know what I mean? So I think it's important.
Do you remember the first time you cried over entrepreneurship?
I mean, look, I'm a crier, meaning like I don't yell, I cry. So if I get really upset, I'm like, so the first time I cried about entrepreneurship, I don't know, too many times to count. Really, I think it's, again, because men are less likely to cry, I think it's probably more notable when, a grown man of like some age, whatever, like ends up crying like a baby. I've cried, way too many times. I've cried in meetings, I've cried at town halls, like, but again, I think not because I'm like some waterworks person, but because that's how I experience stress. Like when I get really stressed out, I'm most likely to cry. And I think that the feedback I've gotten from people about that, and again, I've always been embarrassed when it's happened, but then the feedback I've gotten is like, wow, like that was really, that made us think not more highly of you, that's the wrong word, but it was nice to see you just being vulnerable, because again, it's not something necessarily that people always see in their, in their leaders. So again, it is what it is. Even if it wasn't optimal, I think I would still, that's kind of the way I am. But it's good to see that when that happens, people resonate with it rather than sort of, something else. So
Right. So that the whole that empathy is always leading with empathy, and from our brief interaction so far, you can see definitely that you lead with your heart on your sleeve.
thanks.
And being able to really just from your own personal experiences of what you grew up with and being able to see what it's like. And especially now you see the 21st century, and especially into 2021, where people are more open to talking about their trauma, more open
Yep.
to talking about their mental health and challenges, which is the most
Yep.
beautiful thing too, right?
Yep.
I think we definitely have to make a separation what's real trauma, not trauma, because trauma is
Sure.
becoming a very generalized word right now.
Sure.
But it's so helpful and beautiful to see how even companies are embracing and talking about it in
Yeah.
open over there.
Yeah. At least, small companies like Pymetrics. So
Small, amazing companies are making a
well,
big dent.
thank you. Thank you.
But I want to talk about your early days. You
Sure.
were 37 when you started Pymetrics.
Yep.
Right? You left the whole field of education,
Mhm.
academia. If you want, you could tap into that because I'm sure there's probably recorded in multiple places
Mhm.
of why you left it. If not, you could tap into it. But you're 37.
Mhm.
You're divorced.
Mhm.
You have a 7-year-old girl.
Mhm.
Right? You
Mhm.
have everything stacked against you.
Mhm.
Especially it was founded in 2015, where it wasn't
Mhm.
common to have
Right.
multiple female founders. I mean,
Right.
you're probably, on top of my head, I can maybe think of maybe 10
Mhm.
back then.
Mhm. Yeah. Yep.
Why, like, what it was that urge, that push to go ahead and say, "Oh, let me try to go ahead. I mean, I know you're an overachiever, hard worker, everything like that, but let me try."
Right. Like, why didn't I pick something easier? My dad asked me the same question, actually. So it was so funny, because I transitioned out of academia through the business school at Harvard. And, my dad, who's a, sort of very traditional Italian man, thought, oh, finally, my daughter's going to go to business school and get like a regular career. He always thought science was sort of like this. We don't have any scientists in my family. So then when I told him that I was going to start a company, he's like, oh, Frida, do you think that's a good idea? Like, very concerned. He's like, he didn't really say like, didn't you come here to get a real job? But I think he basically, sort of implied that. Look, I think at the end of the day, I left academia for a variety of reasons, mostly because I went into academia, as I told you, because I saw, a close relative struggle with mental illness and I wanted to find a cure. Then I realized after 10 years of studying the brain that a cure probably wasn't going to happen, unfortunately. And so then I became frustrated because I was like, brain imaging is amazing, but unless you want to start poking electrodes in people's brains, it's actually not a place where you can sort of act and do anything, right? And as a total sidebar, I'll never forget having a conversation with Ed Boyden at MIT, who basically, was all about optogenetics, and he had, sort of developed this technique, that sort of if you, shine light on a part of the brain, you can activate certain aspects of those neurons. And, he was telling me like, oh, well, the gating factor to getting this to become more mainstream is there not enough neurosurgeons in the country. And I was like, okay, I don't want to go into like, a field where the gating factor to some sort of helping people is the number of neurosurgeons in the country. So I just realized like, okay, well, I want to have more impact with, this cool science that we've developed. I really want to help people. How can I do that? So I went to business school. And then I saw recruiting firsthand. And then I thought to myself, okay, well, there were several things I saw about recruiting. One is that it was very resume based, right? Like, and everyone knew it was on someone's resume. That wasn't the hard part of what they were trying to figure out. The hard part of what they were trying to figure out is all the sort of emotional component of who someone is. The second thing is, you saw bias. I mean, you saw age bias, you saw gender bias, you saw, racial bias, and you couldn't ever like say for sure, but it was like happening enough that you kind of suspected it. And then, of course, you don't see, to your point, like a lot of women, certainly not single moms, like, represented in sort of, general tech entrepreneurship. So all of those things made me realize like we have a solution that could really help sort of undermine bias of all kinds, bias against age, ethnicity, gender, disability, all types of bias, right? And I truly believe in that. um, and it could really help people, and I'm kind of uniquely positioned to do this, right, because of my background. So that's what led me to want to start Pymetrics. I just saw this amazing opportunity, and again, I think that like you start out with this amazing idea and then you realize, wow, it's really hard to like do it, actually, make it work. But I'm still inspired all the time, and of course there's always bumps in the road, and every day is a new bump, and the bigger you get, the sort of the bumps are, more you feel them more. But I think at the end of the day, it was just being inspired by the potential to actually help people, and the more I've done this work, I think I've just become even more passionate about the mission. I think at the beginning I was like, yeah, it's sort of like an interesting sort of scientific concept, there's bias, we're going to remove it, yeah, hopefully I'll help people. But the more we've done this work, the more we've seen companies using Pymetrics, like I'll never forget the first time one of our early clients told us the story, which is that after using Pymetrics, they had to change their relocation policies for interns because, unbeknownst to them, they had been hiring such a economically non-diverse pool of people. They had been going to 10 core schools, hiring people mostly from middle class or upper class, or higher backgrounds. And then they started using Pymetrics, and all of a sudden they were hiring people that had literally never been on a plane before, whose parents couldn't afford to help them, rent an apartment and get more furniture because maybe their parents didn't have that, and it was really like a goosebump moment of like, I have now actually allowed people who previously were not allowed into this workforce, an entry point, not I personally, but like our technology, right? And seeing all of the ways in which people have increased gender diversity, ethnic diversity, socioeconomic diversity, diversity of all types, to me is really inspiring and has just led me to want to do more in that area. So again, how did I end up going down this path when it didn't seem very easy? It's just, again, it's just being very passionate about what we're trying to do. And then at the end of the day, like I kind of call it a disease. Like I have a disease of wanting to help people. And sometimes I wish I didn't, because not a disease is too strong a word, but sometimes I'm like, why can't I just want to, like, I don't know, like cut grass or, whatever, like do something that like seems a lot easier. But, because again, I think trying to fix problems in the world is can be challenging, because the world is set up a certain way. And oftentimes it's not by accident, it's by design, so you're kind of butting up against structures that have been around for a long time and hard to change. But I think it's worth it in the end. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. So
Wow. Wow. I hope you stick with it until 180 years old,
well, I don't know if my longevity is going to go that far, but I'm sticking to it. So
Incredible. The only is when you hear you talk more and more and more, you hear it's a few themes I constantly hear. So a big theme obviously is empathy.
mhm,
Another theme I hear obviously is resilience. A lot of resilience you
mhm,
had, um, and obviously wanting to do good and make an impact.
mhm.
And that only, the full circle is that only someone can only have that if they had to be resilient themselves in their own lives. And someone
Yep.
can only have that, they had to know what is true, having true empathy towards someone else. And
Yep.
obviously, which makes our upbringing everything like it. But it's just incredible to hear it how you. It's not something it's actually who you are, and it's actually
Mhm.
practical on a daily basis.
Yep.
Where in your startup life, in your personal life, and
Yep.
everything else over there,
Yep.
it's
Yep.
amazing.
Yeah. Well, and I think it just goes back to sort of, my childhood, where when you see someone who, is so impaired that, they're not able to work, they're not able to, like, just so impaired, you really developed a sense of, I don't want to call it survivor's guilt, that might sound too strange, but you really think like, wow, I'm so lucky. I know this sounds weird, but like, I'm so lucky in comparison, and then you think to yourself, like, what can I do to help people that are not as fortunate? And again, I didn't grow up in poverty, I didn't grow up in a war zone, so those were not the types of misfortunes that I saw. But I think there's a lot, again, it's back to this piece of like, I think, um just feeling like, there are lots of things one can do in life, and there's lots of suffering in the world, so whatever we can do to lessen that, I think is a good thing. Anyways, this is very serious, we should go on to light topics, otherwise your audience is going to be like, this is depressing.
On the contrary, I think this will help some more people than talking about the typical boring stuff,
Okay, all right, fine.
So
So
then how do you educate your children now? I mean,
yeah, I think that's a good question, right? Because my kids, for better or worse, like all three of them, well, don't have not had, to deal with, such upfront, adversity. And so that's a really good question. I think about that a lot. I do instill in them that, I think, people who grew up with a lot of resources, then I think it's our job to find ways to improve society for the better, right? Because again, we have to be aware that those resources are not equally distributed, and therefore I think it's our job um to to do a lot, with those resources. Otherwise, I think it's just, yeah, I don't think that's the message that, I hope to impart to my kids, so.
So then let me ask you, you leave obviously college, academia, where
Mhm.
you're making maybe, I don't know, what, $40,000 a year, let's say,
37. Yep.
$7,000, hundreds
Mhm.
of thousands of dollars in debt, who knows, if Harvard's not coming after you still, I
Yeah,
don't
I had a fellowship, so luckily there was no debt, but yeah. Yeah.
let me imagine, right?
Yep.
And now you're on the polar opposite of that, the polar opposite, right? If we could be totally frank, open, no, you have a successful company. I haven't checked your own personal financial statement, send it to me afterwards, but like you're a polar opposite
Yeah,
of
it's a different situation for sure. Yep.
what's feelings about that. And like you're
No different than what I said before. I think that it's just even more incumbent upon me to fight the good fight, you know what I mean? And not to take up lawn mowing. Not that there's not difficulty in lawn mowing, but like, and I'm using that as a silly example, but like something that maybe potentially had, the less ability to give back. So I do think that is, for better or worse, I think that just makes it more important for me in any case that, this idea of giving back. And I think, look, and I think it's a really interesting time for that because, and I wonder about this sometimes because, we've had the philanthropic model of giving back, right? Which is, you take money from wealthy people and then you give it back, right? That's a model that's been around for a long time. But that to me, and again, there's wonderful things about that model, so I'm not trying to trash it, but it only goes so far, right? Because, again, it's like teaching someone to fish rather than, giving them fish. I think in some cases, some of it could be more of the latter, right? So then you have sort of social impact ventures like Pymetrics, right? We're clearly a social impact venture where, yes, we are for profit, but we have a stated and very by design social impact sort of, intentionality about, the product that we've created. And I think, that hasn't been around that long, right? And so I think it'll be interesting to see how well that as an asset class does, right? And I think that, you see a couple of things with that as an asset class in the sense that, sometimes things that are not really social impact, I think, get labeled that, and funded as such. And then I think, other times I think, it's I think it's just going to be interesting to see how it all plays out because I think there's a lot of potential and promise. I think sometimes people are somewhat skeptical because, especially if you think about technology companies, they don't have the best reputation in the general media, I would say, right? And even though, no, it's so funny whenever somebody says, "Oh, well, you're big tech," I'm like, "Man, we're little to medium tech. We're definitely not big tech," So, but regardless of whether you're little, medium, or big tech, like tech in general has sort of, in the public eye is, something to be suspicious of many times. And so I think it's interesting being a social impact venture that's also a technology venture because we absolutely practice what we preach. We show all of the results that we have. And I think that there's still always this like a little bit of an inherent skepticism and like, can a for-profit company, a for-profit tech company, actually do good in the world? And again, my hope is that there are enough examples of these types of companies where, public skepticism, diminishes. Because I think it is so important to have that model, right? Like I think philanthropy is important, but that can't be the only way that we try to improve on the world, right? And so I think it is really important to have social impact ventures, but that's a new thing. And so we'll see kind of how they end up doing.
right. It's a funny thing, charity is such a funny thing because as incredible as it is, it's also the most selfish thing possible. Because when you think about it, who's benefiting more? The giver always walks out feeling so much greater and
Yeah.
more confident than
Yeah.
the person receiving it all the time. So charity is the most beautiful thing
Yeah.
possible. Like you're able to
Yeah.
help somebody and you feel good about it, but also the most
Yeah.
selfish thing. At the same time, I think we have a very when you talk about giving philanthropy, it's not. You have to understand it's a two-way street here because the giver has an obligation to give and the
Mhm.
receiver has an obligation to receive.
Hmm.
So it's not a one-way give or take relationship. It's a full circle type of thing where I'm fulfilling something you're missing, you're fulfilling something that I'm missing, and it comes around
Right.
full circle around there.
Right.
And
Right.
if we treat philanthropy not in like in a way that obviously people have what they're passionate about, their personal projects and things like
Sure.
it, it's incredible, but in a way that really that's we're making the real difference, and I'm here to fulfill the obligation of my giving, and you're here to fulfill the obligation of receiving. Not just me, I'm the better man over here because I'm giving.
Right.
It's a whole new different paradigm shift to the way how we work, look at it, and everything.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I mean, there's different models of philanthropy, obviously, and there's all sorts of, philanthropic, venues for actually, in quotes, teaching how to fish, right? So there's no, it's not so much that, it's not so much that I have a problem with, I think philanthropy is great. And, we're engaged, I'm engaged in a lot of philanthropic activities. It's more just that, like, for example, like the type of structural barriers that we see in hiring are not going to be fixed by philanthropy. They
Right.
actually have to be fixed by a whole host of things, including better technology and legislative changes and all sorts of stuff. So I think that I guess all I'm trying to say is I think what I've learned, right, in my last 10 years of doing this, is just that there are problems, hard problems that I don't think that just a philanthropic approach can solve. And part of that is, actually building technology and or, having business models or whatever, like basically engaging in sort of the realm of business to solve these problems. But again, I think there is a lot of rightful skepticism of these types of business models because I think they can be used as sort of ethics washing, greenwashing, all of that good stuff where somebody just slaps a label on it and actually is doing a bunch of stuff that maybe is not so great. So, and that's unfortunate. So
100%.
we'll
And the
see.
question is, do companies have an obligation to do good? Now, we're talking about individual
Yeah.
people, CEOs, founders, yes, they could do it in their own personal, but
Yeah.
the companies themselves have an obligation to do good.
I mean, they don't, I mean, in my mind, yes, but I don't think that's the common opinion. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that, no, I think most people think companies have the obligation to make money, right? I mean, that's what they're there for, right? Um, and that's the capitalism. So I think that, the prevailing thought would be no. Obviously I think that, and I've heard this a lot. I mean, I've heard this a lot, from certain circles in any case that, and again, I don't think it's a widely held opinion, but I think there is sort of, whether you want to call it conscious capitalism or whatever the framing is, right? I think there has to be, in my mind, a shift towards realizing that, pure capitalism is not is and again I'm not arguing for socialism or communism. I'm just saying sheer sort of market driven capitalism I don't think is the right way to go. And I think there's a lot of economic sort of arguments for that, and people have made it. There's this woman called Heather Boucher that wrote this book called, I think it's Unbound, sort of talking about sort of when you take it to its extreme, it actually just doesn't do great things for the world. Again, not that I don't think we need a book to tell us that. I think you can just go look around. But so again, I think no, most people would say that's not what they're here for, and that's not what capitalism tells you. But I personally think we're entering a phase where we have to rethink whether just sheer capitalism is the right model.
Right.
Again, not arguing that socialism or capital or communism is. I think it's more just, again, there's these labels that are getting thrown out, including conscious capitalism and all that stuff. So
Right. And I think only time will tell. I mean, you're obviously the smart one over here, so I'm listening to you. I'm getting information from you over here. But going back to there's three pivotal moments in a startup.
mhm,
Obviously, founding day, the
mhm.
first customer,
Yep.
first main customer, and the first angel investment.
Mhm, mhm.
Remember who your first angel investor was?
Yeah. Yep.
How'd that go down? Because you bootstrapped for the first 7 months, I'm assuming.
For 15 months. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, look, I think that, we had met just, people that were believers in the technology and believers in, myself and my co-founder, and that's sort of how it went. I mean, I think that's a pretty typical, founding or not founding story, but first angel investor story, and it's really interesting because, a year or two ago, there was a woman that I knew from MIT who was starting a very cool dyslexia. She's a dyslexia researcher, and she was starting essentially a company to do early screening of dyslexia. And again, my oldest has dyslexia, and so it's something that is near and dear to my heart. And I remember her sending out this email and sort of explaining the company and everything else. And I was like, oh, I'll totally angel invest in your company, right? And she was like, and I remember just her reaction was like, well, you're the first person, whatever. And then it ended up that they didn't need, my angel investment. but she was like, you believing in us, you putting in that first, small amount of money was like what allowed us to go forward. And I completely remember that feeling of like the first person that just says, I believe in you enough that I'm going to put in, some small amount of money, like, 10K, 25K, whatever it is, right? To an angel investor, that's a small amount of money, right? And it was such an amazing thing to be in that position, to be like, wow, I was that person, and now they don't even need my money because they've gone and raised, because it's such a cool idea, they don't need it. And that was such a great feeling, right? So again, I think it was a very heartwarming moment for me to be able to be in that position for someone else.
But you only got that position 15 months after you started the company.
Yes, yes. We were in an interesting position where we were able to bootstrap by basically having a hedge fund basically kind of use our technology, and pay us enough that we could survive for 15 months on a check that they gave us. So yeah.
So what was it being like being a grown woman, 38, right?
Yeah.
Whole new career. Like we mentioned before, if you're living with your daughter, but not only that, you bunked up together with your co-founder in the same apartment.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, there was definitely, I call it the two women in an algorithm phase of the company, where we were sharing an apartment. My daughter was living in this at the time. It was pretty
Yeah,
crazy. I mean, it was very, like, talk about like not being able to get away from work. It was basically impossible. Yeah, it was tough. I mean, it was like definitely not easy, but it was also very exciting. I mean, it's just, again, it's like back to, there's the excitement, and then there's the hard reality, and I think they've always kind of gone hand in hand. So
right, for sure. Did you share duties of babysitting?
no, no. My co-founder was like a dyed-in-the-wool MIT engineer who like would stay up until 4 in the morning, and like we'd be up at 7, like tiptoeing around the apartment, be like, shh, don't wake her up, like. So no, there was no babysitting. Yeah.
Wow. So you have so many, different pivotal moments in your life and
Mhm.
your career. I mean, so many. It's
Yep.
like I can't even, and the amount that I've heard already, and I'm assuming you
Yep.
probably have a list of them if you can even recall all of them. Are there any that really stand out? They shaped who you are?
No, I mean, look, I think all of the things we talked about really, um we all have pivotal moments. We all have lots of things that shape who we are. You know what I mean? And I think some of the, I think what's interesting, I will say this, I think some of the moments that are hardest are actually the most pivotal and shape us the most. You know what I mean? So like, again, sounds silly, like, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Like, so even though you're at the time you're going through it, you're like, wow, I hate this. This is so awful, like so uncomfortable. Like, am I doing the right thing? Like, blah, 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 all this stuff. Like, I think the most amount of growth happens during difficult times. And that doesn't mean that you just want your life to be like one unending saga of difficult times, because like, you need a break. You need to be like, oh, that was hard, I need to take a break. So I'm not suggesting that it's like, 24/7 should be like that. But I do think, again, in my life, historically, I would say that, from the hardest times have come, the most personal growth, and sort of coming out the other side stronger, better, all the rest of it. So, and I don't think I've learned yet, because every new hard time I'm like, oh, this sucks. Like, why do I have to do this? This is, I get angry and upset and everything else. But so I haven't learned to gracefully accept that as I should, but I think it's definitely true, and hopefully that resonates with people, that, you generally, if you can go through a hard time and then learn from it, and then realize that, you did something really hard, and, you're able to, overcome, I think it helps. And I think the other thing is just that usually when something's really hard, I mean, it can be hard for just basic reasons, like I don't have money or something like that. But it can also be hard because it's pushing you outside of your comfort zone. You know what I mean? In the sense that, like, we all want to be comfortable on some level. I want to be comfortable when I go to bed at night. I want to be comfortable when I eat my lunch, whatever. But I think just being comfortable doesn't actually make you a better person, right? So I'm going to actually tell you a funny related story. So I went to a wedding recently, a Jewish wedding. And the rabbi, I had an actually like laugh out loud moment at this wedding, because, the rabbi was going on, and then he's like, some people make the big mistake of marrying people that make them happy. Okay. This is during the vows. I was like laughing so hard. I knew where he was going with it. His next line was like, really, you need to marry someone who's going to challenge you, and that ultimately will make you happy. But that line alone just was like, I was like, you did not just say that in the middle of wedding vows. But he's right, in the sense that I think, and it's true for life in general, like I think we have to challenge ourselves, because challenging ourselves, I think, makes us better people. rather than just seek, comfort. But it's also, it's just, you also need respite in between, because you need to kind of like get your feet under you again. So
Exactly. It's like you mentioned, don't constantly seek out that discomfort because then
yeah,
you're never always gonna be there. But the only
yeah,
reason why through going through a low is in order to reach a higher place than
yeah,
you were before the low.
yeah, yeah,
All that. But
yeah.
as human beings, we were wired in a way that we just run away from discomfort. We run away from all those feelings and everything that
Totally.
comes up.
Totally. And I think the world has to kind of force us there, and I think that, and when you're forced in that position, I think hopefully you accept the challenge and you do it. But yeah.
Wow. So what is your TED speech? I mean, because you have so many avenues to go to different ways. Like talk about these.
Um, Again, running a company, having 3 kids, trying to see my husband sometimes, like have not found time for that TED speech. I mean, maybe at some point I will. I don't know. I don't have a TED speech yet. I'm just, I don't know. You'd have to tell me. You'll have to tell me what the TED speech is. I'm not sure. I will say, I think one thing that, you know, like even in this podcast, I'm like, okay, I'm going to be totally transparent here. I'm having these moments of like, oh my God, I can't believe I've said all these things. I can't believe I've been so transparent. I need to tell.
Record.
No, I've been like, I'm gonna have to tell Ephraim that after this podcast, he's got to kill it because this is just way too vulnerable, like in a public setting. Um, and I have this expression that I say, I feel like I've just like, I've like, I'm naked. I feel like I'm naked. And there are people who, can take that and I won't say misuse it, but like, use it for like to make fun of you or to this or that. But I also think that like it hopefully resonates with people. I think what I'm trying to say is like if I had a TED talk, I think it would be about transparency, like the value of transparency, because it is very hard. It's very hard to be open. It's very hard to be authentic and honest and open because you're sort of subjecting yourself to people being like, oh, and like just I don't know, making fun of you or just saying things that aren't nice or whatever the case may be, right? And it will hurt more because you've like put your real self out rather than your sort of facade, right? But at the same time, I think the flip side is when you do that, I think people really, it inspires people to do the same. And I think that's what's important to me. It's just sort of like inspiring people to do something that I think in the end of the day makes, helps them, and and also just helps in general, like make the world a more, more transparent, equitable place. So that would be my TED talk. I don't exactly know like how that's going to come to be, but
We're definitely gonna make it happen, but like maybe one life is so much more important than 1,000, negative sayers because they have nothing to do with their life and they troll people,
yeah, I know. I know. It's true.
Sometimes it just boils down to people that have that is because obviously jealousy. People that are
Yeah.
not comfortable with themselves. People that have
Yeah.
been through their own trauma that's still trying to
Yeah.
figure out.
Yeah. No, I hear you. I hear you. But I think we all have that fear, right? Of like, I'm going to expose myself. I'm going to say something that's like, coming from a place of, who I really am. And then that experience will happen and then it will just not feel great. You know what I mean? And all I'm trying to say is like, I'm actively struggling with it right now. And this podcast, I'm like, oh, I've said all these things. But I think at the end of the day, it's the right thing to do. Because all of the things we've talked about, whether it's, mental illness or whether it's a family members or your own, or, whatever the case may be, I think it's just important topics to discuss. And I think that people don't talk about them because they don't want to, have some negative reaction, someone saying something negative, so.
It's like we said in the beginning of this show, where Bradfield wrote something over there, and you mentioned that it's not spoken about enough. I think a lot of the things we spoke about over here are not spoken about enough that have to be brought
Yeah.
to the surface.
Yeah.
Every single topic we spoke about.
Thanks.
So then, what do we tell a young Frida? She has the ability. Like, imagine your daughter now. That's about to go into college, and then she's going to graduate college in 2, 3 years from
Yep.
now. So imagine young Frida. She has the ability to,
Yep.
go down this whole academia route that she did. She could
Yep.
go. She had enough of all those academics. She could go work in the local Starbucks next to Harvard over
Mhm.
there. She could even maybe join the U.S. soccer team because we could use some good help over there. Or or we go the entrepreneur route. What type of message do we tell her?
I mean, I think the message is, again, I found sound like a broken record, but I think the hardest part of being young is I don't think you've really figured out who you are yet. And I think even now, uh, the age that I'm at now, which wouldn't be considered young, like I
Absolutely.
still haven't, totally figured out who you are. But I think it's a process. I think you learn more and more about yourself and who you are. And so I think that that's what we can help people be as at the earliest age possible. I think it's like just being okay, and actually not only being okay, but really accepting and loving who they are. You know what I mean? And I think that's really hard because I think in general, well, probably harder for some than others. But my point is simply like, there are all these societal expectations for men, for women, for this, for that, and I think that like so much of being a teenager, I watch my 15-year-old and I'm like, oh God, like, high school was tough, because it's just a constant stream of like, this is what you should be. So I think whatever the best thing we can do is, and especially having three girls, like, and seeing each one of them have very different personality, and helping them be who they are, right? So it's this question of like, don't think you have to be this, and this just because you were told that. So it's I think your job as a parent is to accept your kid for who they are, which hopefully isn't too hard. Help them accept themselves for they are, which may be hard or not hard, and then just really help them learn who they are, because a lot of times I don't think people really know who they are when they're young, which is normal, right? You don't know. And so helping them on a path that allows themselves to be really who they are.
Right.
And I think that's so important, because I think no matter, like, it's back to the discussion at the very beginning, like whether you have a you know extensive educational history or not, or whatever, like I think so long as it resonates with who you are as a person, then it's the right choice for you. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally, totally. Wow. I mean, firstly, your parenting skills, I'm sure, are definitely on par. Like, but you have to allow them.
I'll have my 15-year-old come next time. She'll be like, oh, my mom, she forgets everything. I have to remind her about things 10,000 times. So she'll tell you all the ways in which I fail as a parent. So
Part of the learning experience. Part of the
for
learning
sure,
experience.
for sure.
And we have to allow ourselves, like you mentioned, younger selves to make those mistakes because it's part of the experience
Totally,
of who we become.
totally. Yep,
And,
for sure.
wow. I feel, I don't know how to thank you. I feel so much smarter, now than before I walked into the conversation. I've learned a tremendous amount.
I'm glad. I'm
So,
glad. I'm glad.
inspired and hearing about your journey and hearing about everything we spoke about, all these important topics.
Yep.
There's no doubt in my mind that this is going to inspire thousands of people to take control of their life, wherever they're holding in entrepreneurship, outside entrepreneurship. But it's going to give them the ability to get them inspired to open up about their own personal journey,
Yeah.
not to have the shame, the guilt, and everything else that comes together with it,
Mhm.
but to allow themselves to really experience and allow themselves to relate to someone else and to really open up so they can better their own lives. So, Frida, I want to thank you so, so, so much.
Rima, I want to thank you.
And we're definitely going to have to do it another one because there's so many more topics to talk about. The second segment of, you know, but thank you.
Sign me up. Sign me up.